Happy Victoria Day, everyone. I'm sorry to do this on Victoria Day, but I thought I would get Principle 3 done, manage slow variables and feedbacks. This chapter, I find, has some interesting things inside it, which is chapter 5, by the way. Uh, One of the interesting things I would say about this chapter overall, right, a general observation is note the title, Manage Slow Variables and Feedbacks. We'll talk about slow variables. They give numerous examples. And feedbacks, we've already seen feedbacks in the very design of the social economic system model, right? It sits right in there. So the reason I draw your attention to the title is this approach that we see in this text. This approach is becoming, as we move through the text, more and more a management approach. So it's very interesting to see this. Here's the problem. It can be difficult managing if you believe that a social ecological system is in fact an adaptive system, a complex adaptive system. It's not clear that you can manage your way through such a system because there are potentially so many feedbacks, so many variables, slow or quick or in between, that it becomes almost an impossible task to manage. So we live in the age of big data and data analytics. And to be honest, that will help a bit, I think, because it will allow us to take enormous data sets and make sense of them. And if this project is going to work as a management project, then we'll need that kind of data support, there's no doubt. So I think some of this depends on the development of a robust data science. Now, that may be obvious to all of you, but if not, I would just point that out. It seems to be an obvious implication of this general approach, and it is a management approach. So we're now talking about how we're going to manage these systems. And here I'm thinking of the ecosystem services, and of course the SES itself, right? So with that as a bit of an introduction, let's turn to the text. One more point, if I may. When I say it's a management approach, I don't want to be seen to be condemning it at all. I think even in the case of transformation, which we will go into later, you cannot manage your way through a transformation. Leadership is a requirement. But that doesn't mean that management is irrelevant to transformation, or that management is irrelevant to any desirable change we may seek to achieve. Management comes again with our frontal lobes, because management is about organizing, classifying, ordering the world in some way so that we can manage it. We can establish principles and processes over these core entities, whatever they are in our system. So with that said, we have here, I think, a management approach to ecosystem services based on the principle of resilience. So I think earlier there was more science than a tilt towards management. Now we're beginning to see the tilt towards management. We've seen the tilt towards governance. We're going to see more of that, because when we talk about managing and governing, we're talking about human activities, right? So I don't think, to be honest, I don't think complex adaptive systems have governance bodies of any kind. See, again, we can debate that. I don't mean to be so categorical. But I would keep these points in mind by way of preface. I don't want to take too long today. It's a holiday. but you can see the importance of this is on in chapter 5 on page 105, the importance of managing slow variables. We'll talk about those. I think they're pretty obvious. You know, what's a slow variable? Oh, it might be, now slow is it's a relative term, of course, but think of soil erosion. It doesn't happen in a day, it doesn't happen in a week, it doesn't happen in a month, barring cataclysmic changes, floods, for example. Soil erosion can take place over decades and often does. And we're seeing it across sub-Saharan Africa. We're seeing the belt, essentially the Saharan belt, increase north and south, right? So, and we see desertification in many other parts of the world. That would be a slower variable according to this text, if I'm reading it properly. So to continue the quote, the importance of managing slow variables and feedbacks to maintain social ecological regimes that produce desired bundles of ecosystem services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see here that this, what we're doing is we're using, if you will, sustainability science to manage these slow variables and feedback. Because we know feedback systems are part of a complex adaptive system, any such system. It's a complex adaptive system because it's connected to things outside itself, and it can accommodate change. It has the inner capacity to accommodate change. Now, what I wanted to point out is they talk here about configurations, and they say, for example, this is just an example of how things can work inside these systems. For example, this is on 106. It has been shown that in substantial parts of the world, rainfall and soil conditions are such that it is possible for ecosystems to be configured either as forests or as savannas. So the point here is slow variables, if left to themselves, so to speak, can produce significant shifts in an ecosystem, say from canopied forests to grassland savannas. And we're familiar with this, right? Anyone who's done a little bit of geography is aware that these so-called slow variables, you could say climate change itself is a set of slow variables. Again, keep in mind, slow is a relative term. You know, in geological time, it's an instant. So it depends on our time scale, right? I want to leave those subtleties aside. So these different configurations, now the configurations are configurations of ecosystems. These different configurations provide different ecological systems. And I think that's obvious, right? So canopied forests, you have wood supplies, you have the plant itself, those sorts of plants. In the case of grasslands, you have grazing, you have, you know, cattle raising, etc. These are ecosystem services, right? So and I don't want to be interpreted as speaking down at that term. I don't like it, but it's a term that points to something real, which is, yes, we graze cattle in grasslands, right? So if we're going to be doing that, carrying out that form of economic activity, we need the appropriate ecosystem. We need to sustain it. So this is what, at the end of the day, resilience is all about, I believe. Such shifts, the authors go on to argue, typically have large and abrupt impacts on the set of ecosystem services produced by the SCS. I still struggle with that language, that the SCS produces ecosystem services, because that would suggest the SCS is somehow moving into those systems, ecological systems, and packaging them so that they become services. So that's a very that's an interventionist model for certain. It strikes me as an exploitative model, but I want to reflect on that. I think we should all reflect on that, because it's not altogether clear that that follows, in my opinion, but it seems to go in that direction, right? And SES creates, in some sense, the ecosystem services it needs. And it does that by somehow governing those systems, in this case, the ecosystems themselves, for human benefit. So it just strikes me as managing these systems with human needs in mind. That's not a crime. I'm just saying, where are the internal needs of nature as a system independent of human beings? Does that have a role here? Now, I wanted to turn to their discussion of what they say here on 107. In most SES, the social ecological system, it appears that a limited set of key variables and internal feedback processes interact to control the configuration of the system. So it's almost the 80-20 kind of thing. There are a few key variables, control variables, often related, by the way, to slow variables of some kind. So this is what they're discussing in this text, and they even pull it again into the human domain by discussing South Africa on 107. And it's interesting because it leaves out, I believe, the entire political struggle in the case of apartheid in South Africa. In any case, we'll just let that go. It's not a fault. It's just a rather incomplete description of what happened there. Now, on 107 near the bottom, I think an important statement, you see the self-organizing complex adaptive system nature of an SCS means that SCSs often do not respond in linear ways to disturbance or gradual changes in key controlling variables, right? So we've already seen that. These complex adaptive systems do not have linear pathways, right? They don't respond in that way. If they did, you could determine how they behave. The fact that they have emergent properties means that you cannot predict what the system will do based on what it has done, right? So I would keep that in mind as you go through the text. A central aspect of maintaining the resilience, this is on 108, of ecosystem services in the face of disturbance and change, therefore, involves identifying and managing the key controlling variables and feedbacks that underpin and control the configuration of an SCS. So how do you ensure the resilience of an SCS? Well, you identify and manage the key controlling variables, right? These are the dominant variables that determine the configuration of the given system, the SCS. So again, these are the strings for the puppeteer, right? In other words, that's a horrible way to put it, but these are the levers of management, right? So what are we going to do if we want to manage the resilience of ecosystems or of ecosystem services? What we're going to do is we're going to manage those key variables. Well, we had to identify them to manage them. We're probably going to measure it in some way too, because that always seems to go along with managing. So on slow variables, let me read what they say. It's important. Some of these variables are slow in the sense that they change more gradually than other fast variables. Again, I gave an example of that, and they give some examples here: soil composition, phosphorus concentration, salt concentration in soils. And, we never talk about soils, but they're critical, uh, critical. So anyhow, I'll let you go through that. On 109, for any given SES, slow variables typically determine the underlying structure of the SES, right? So it's these more dominant, almost ingrained, gradual changing elements within the SES, right? These slow variables. Again, caution, the term slow is relative. And you should know, they go into it here, and we talked about it in the last chapter, I believe. There comes a time when slow becomes very fast. In other words, when you arrive at a tipping point. And their metaphor for this, their model of it is, and where is it? It's what they call the ball. Yes, it's on 117, on controlling slow variables. What do they call it? It's the ball and the groove system. You can see it there. How to control slow variables. So that entire topic I'll allow you to discover on your own. There's nothing complex about slow variables. They're very common. So, and I don't think there's any difficulty in grasping what they are. Different system configurations or regimes, and the shifts between them are often visualized by the metaphor of the ball and cup. There we go. The ball and cup, that's on page 117. That graphic, take a look. You don't need the graphic to understand this. The idea is, if you're moving into a regime change, you're moving from one cup to another. It's a fundamental change, right? And there's resistance. So it's interesting here thus far in this text that they don't talk a lot about resistance, right, to change. So part of the resistance built into this model is in the feedbacks. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. So they talk about regime changes in terms, again, of, for example, grasslands and canopied tree cover, forests, for example. Now, I wanted to go to 118 and 119 and just note something. It has been, this is 118, second paragraph, it has been proposed that exceeding critical thresholds in slow ecological variables can be avoided by better managing, regulating ecosystem services, as these services are often linked to slow controlling variables. Fair enough. But note the emphasis on managing. You're managing services. So the only reason I go on about that is this is becoming, from top to bottom, a management approach to the sustainability of ecosystems. I'll leave out the services for the moment. The last point I wanted to make is on 119, where they discuss for the first time, at any length anyhow, that they discuss transformation. And what they say about transformation is quite interesting. So if you can bear with me, although the two concepts have not often been linked, the notion of social ecological transformation appears to describe similar kinds of systemic reorganization as the idea of ecological regime shifts. There is a similarity for certain. Whether the degree of similarity is, I think, where we would have our debate. Down the page away, to rather than focusing on critical thresholds, however, the transformations literature has stressed the importance of windows of opportunity for enabling transformation, actions to weaken key feedbacks in the old regime, to enable change, and conversely to strengthen key feedbacks once the system is shifted in order to build resilience of the new regime. So what we see here, and to continue, sorry, on the other hand, transformations have also been defined as conceptually distinct from regime shifts. So it's like a regime shift, but it's not a regime shift, and seen to entail the creation of an entirely new system rather than a reconfiguration of the system. So this is a point I think I made in a reflection a while ago. You can see if you see transformation this way, you start with an entity, call it A. There's a process called transformation. You have a new entity B, and it's not A. It's not identical to A. It could be quite different from A. It's a transformation. So this is what they're talking about here, right? Is that the reason why a regime shift may not be the same thing as a transformation is it's not clear that a regime shift requires a change in identity, right? So a regime shift can be a reconfiguration, a reorganization, a reform of, say, System A. But a reform or reconfiguration of System A still has the elements of System A. They may be ordered in different ways, but the elements are the same, right? So what I'm trying to say is in a transformed system, the identity of the system itself has changed. It's no longer what it was. It's something new. It fits into a new category. So you can see here, the reason I bring this up is not to draw a conclusion. I'm a little bit confused by it myself, but I bring it up because it shows, I think, some tension between the regime shift, which is really transformation within the model of a complex adaptive system, and transformation, which is something else. And I think they recognize it's something else. I'm not sure they recognize why it's something else, but they know it's something else. So let me summarize here. This is on page 130. I took my glasses off. I'm sorry this is so long, but this is a complex chapter, and I know I'm kind of brushing over it in a superficial way. In summary, a critical aspect of enhancing the resilience of specific bundles of ecosystem services revolves around the management of slow variables and feedbacks to ensure that the SES remains in a configuration that produces those ecosystem services, i.e., the services it desires, right? So that's the entire point, I think, of this chapter in a sentence. Now, right down at the bottom there, they say a better understanding of how the concept of social ecological transformations connects to these types of changes, regime changes, and of how to manage transformations to entirely new system configurations is therefore critical. Now, it's interesting because I think they're admitting there that there's very little research that anyone has been done, or that anyone has done, sorry, empirical or theoretical. So this is where we are, right? We're on the cusp of transformation here. And you can see that we're we're stepping out farther and farther on a ledge where there's nothing beneath us to catch us, right? Because regime change, as they explain it, is a property, again, of the CAS. It's how it adapts. It's not sure that we can achieve the goal of transformation, however we define that. We haven't done that. But however we define it, it's not clear that we can achieve transformation through this type of regime shift. And I think the authors recognize that. That's why I'm bringing this up. Now, to conclude, just again on the subject of management, management interventions that obscure, remove, or ignore stabilizing feedbacks that underline the provision of desired ecosystem services can also erode the resilience of STS configurations. So the point here is you not only have to manage, you have to manage well, because you can manage poorly. And if you manage poorly, you get poor results. Again, on 126, managing the regulation of ecosystem services. Here it's not regulatory services. They're talking about the regulation of ecosystem services related to nutrient retention in lake catchments, et cetera, et cetera. This is simply about, they give several examples on 126 of how you can manage these things, right? So, again, on 127, they talk about, for instance, although several key controlling slow variables and feedbacks are known with respect to climate change, vested in competing interests and lack of agreement on the appropriate responses have hampered the implementation of a coordinated international response. Yes, and no. Would a CAS have that kind of problem? That's what I would ask. Now, on managing slow, yeah, you can see it again on page 127. How can the principle of managing slow variables and feedbacks be operationalized and applied? So we see in every chapter, they have this operationalization and application section. There's no accident there. These authors, this entire position is trying to put us in a position of managing on the basis of complexity science and sustainability science, these ecosystem services. So I'll close there. There were a number of other little points I had to make here. I might mention in that regard on 132, the third point, there is a need to explore and better integrate the concepts of transformation and regime shifts. This is what I mean. They're aware of this difficulty. So keep that in mind as well. And with that, I will, I'll close this section. I think I've said enough. I hope it's been helpful, and I'm sorry I was pausing all of the time. I haven't had enough coffee yet. So I hope everyone's having a great day. I look forward to reading your papers. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, contact me, please. This chapter, again, it was fascinating because I'm not sure all of this fits together, even in an internal sense. You know, are these principles coherent? I'm not saying they're not. And it's fair enough to ask that question. Are they coherent? Do they fit together? Fair enough. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind. I think it's a valuable approach and principles for building resilience. There's a lot there to contemplate, but it doesn't always hang together well. So I just want everyone to know that I'm aware of that too. Anyhow, enough said. Take care. Bye.